I'm here with Leila Serangi, who's the National Coordinator of Campaign 2000, the campaign to end child poverty in Canada. Thanks for joining me today, Leila. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about child poverty rates in Ontario and what's been happening over the last few years.
So, child poverty in Ontario is still at a really drastic level, even though we have commitments from governments to have ended child poverty by the year 2000. That's where Campaign 2000 gets its name from. We are still looking at 500,000 kids in Ontario living in families whose incomes are below the low income measure. So, kids who are poor, 500,000, that's about more than 1 in 6 kids growing up without having all of their basic needs met. And when we look at who those children are in terms of demographics, we know because of systemic barriers that people and families are facing in Ontario and in Canada, it results in much higher poverty rates for example, First Nations children living on reserve, for First Nation Inuit, Métis children even living off reserve, for racialized immigrant, for children with disabilities or in families whose parents have disabilities, for lone mother-led families. All of these groups facing systemic barriers have much higher rates of child poverty.
Which is a big concern. And I know children are poor because they live in families that are poor, and obviously poverty for adults is also a significant concern. But childhood poverty has lifelong implications, and so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what some of those implications are for children.
It does have lifelong implications. Children who are growing up in households who are poor tend to have worse health and educational outcomes over the longer term. We know adults who experience, for example, homelessness have more likely had their first experience of homelessness as kids under 18. Poverty can be a cycle and very, very hard to get out of.
And there's 900,000 Ontarians who are depending on social assistance today, Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program. And we know a significant portion of those Ontarians are children under the age of 18. So can you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are for kids who are growing up on social assistance?
Yeah, so social assistance rates, whether it's Ontario Works or the Ontario Disability Support Program, neither of those programs are bringing family incomes up to the low income measure. Even with additional benefits like the Canada Child Benefit, we know that those family incomes are falling below the low income measure. That means, it can mean things like parents are working odd hours, precarious work to try and close that income gap so they're not at home with their kids. Oftentimes, kids are left alone, they're caring for their siblings. It means very often that families are skipping meals. Kids are going to school hungry, so therefore they're less able to concentrate. Sometimes kids are working to help contribute to family income, so they have less time to focus on schoolwork or socializing or being a kid. Oftentimes we hear a lot of families having to make the choice between paying for food or paying for medication that somebody in that household needs and paying for utilities. And, we just talked about access to broadband and phone. And these are the choices that families are making every day that in the end, kids are having to go without, and it sets them back. It sets them behind. And unfortunately, in our society, we still have a stigma around poverty and around kids going to school without the new clothes or the nice shoes or the brand name this and that. So there's even this stigma associated, and for those kids it is very stressful. It adds a lot of stress to their day-to-day lives.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand that better. And thank you for all the work that Campaign 2000 does to fight for kids and for all people living in poverty in Ontario and Canada.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
having me.